And next, Günter Sölken from Attac Berlin. We'll talk about a more sustainable and fairer world economic order, whether that would be possible in a multipolar world. Thank you, Günter. Thank you for inviting me. Okay, Annette Groth's already stole 90% of what I wanted to say. So, in order to avoid duplicating it, I'll change my title. If we're talking about a world beyond war, it's not the U.S. military, but our economic system. Last 2 years ago, every day 340,000 people died of hunger. It's per year, that's over 8 million. Yeah. Okay, the number of people killed in wars estimated at 158 million. This includes things like ethnic cleansing. Okay, a number of, perhaps some people say only 100 million people killed in wars. Okay, to reach the number that the hunger will do that in just over 20 years. So that's the real point. How is our world economic order? Okay, mainly this is neoliberal globalization. And this von Hayek, in a book of 1944, that liberal economic policies should be not only in their constitutions, but the countries needed to be tied up in a tight network of economic treaties that prevent a change of government leading to anti-liberal economic policies.
Dieser Masterplan ist gültig. Ist verfeinert worden.
This master plan is still in effect and has been refined. For example, by the Washington Consensus, there must be austerity everywhere, and there must be privatization everywhere. And this is executed, all this, largely implemented by the IMF. Wolfenson was former head of the World Bank, created the expression stateless global governance. So, yes, there should be control and governance, but without any states. All these free trade agreements, a free trade agreement is just completely false name. But what we have is treaties that forbid countries from acting, but allow multinational corporations to do anything they want and to sue countries where their profits have been limited. And we started quite early. They started first with the developing countries in Africa. The same day that Declaration of Independence is issued, neocolonialism began again. First, these countries didn't have money to finance their infrastructure, They didn't have any tax system. And who came? The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And these institutions, if you look at them, the International Monetary Fund, it's structured like a private corporation. It's not one country, one vote, but it's and depends on how your votes depend on how much you've paid in. So the U.S. for years was able to have a veto. So the IMF was only able to do what the U.S. Favored. Now the situation has changed a bit. Now the EU states vote jointly, so they have even more votes than the U.S. So now policies of the IMF cannot pass without the approval of the EU. The IMF grants loans, but only if these are in agreement with the policies they advocate. Okay. There are negotiations, and formally, the recipients of these loans give voluntary declarations about what they will do, but these are dictated by the IMF bureaucrats. We have a free market and no duties on exports or imports. We should privatize everything possible. We should privatize even water supplies. Occasionally, they even demand that there are pupils in public schools are supposed to pay fees. And in poor countries, the demand that is just madness. There are cases known from Africa where the World Bank that strategic stocks of foods were dissolved because they impair free pricing. And if we look at what happens with and happens in the Chicago Board of Trade, they speculate on price of food. At the moment, there are 65 million people who are refugees. And one reason for this is that the IMF and we as the EU prevent these countries from establishing their own independent economies and feeding their own populations. It's madness. If you look at how many people die, Africa die, but you can also see that other countries get the foods from Africa. Saudi Arabia and China are growing their food in Africa. It's called land grabbing now. In extreme cases, Ethiopia. And Indian businessmen set up a farm that's as big as the country of Luxembourg. And where they grow roses on fruitful farming land. And they grow, and it grows basmati rice with a clear objective, and in order to influence the prices in the international markets for rice. Africa need not hunger. We impose monocultures on these countries. So our coffee, our cotton, our cocoa is growing there. And now they're even planting soybeans so that we can feed our cattle. So it's not just in South America, but also in Africa. Scandals like this, we have to stop doing these things. We, and by we I mean civil society, we've absolutely neglected international trade and economic policies. Well, we deluded into thinking that TTIP was an American threat against Europeans, but we're gradually recognizing that we, as neo-colonialists, are doing to the whole world. One particular scandal I'd like to mention: the day of Declaration of Independence, neo-colonialism began. France allowed countries to become independent, but imposed reparations for the infrastructure that they installed in the colonies. And they are so high that they are still a relevant factor in the French government's budget. Just as scandalous is that we as a civil society are demonstrating against TTIP and CETA, but neglecting the APIs, the international, the EU free trade agreements with African countries that have been almost ignored. And there's still no focus of attention on them. These EPAs are a crime which inscribes neocolonialism into the structures of society, that ensure that European investors have to be treated in Africa just like locals. Countries are never able to give subsidies to their peasant farmers because they'd have to give the same subsidies to foreign soft drink producers and large-scale agricultural firms. The EU itself was entirely protectionist in its policies. And the EU wanted to achieve European food sovereignty, and that's why these huge agricultural subsidies. That was understandable. But to the poor countries of Africa, we're not willing to allow them to have such protective tariffs. It's just necessary if a country wants to emancipate itself, if it wants to ensure that it has its own industrial farms and that there is a domestic demand. We continue to ensure that there is as many monocultures in Africa as possible. But natural and traditional methods of farming are simply made impossible. There are experiments. What can do with traditional African methods of farming and the cuisine. There's a great amount of variety in Africa. Africa would be able to feed itself entirely. And let me give another example. The question of raw materials. Africa has the most raw materials in the world and is the weakest economically for the simple reason that these unprocessed raw materials are exported. So the added value and the profit which capitalism depends on is only generated here. If we just imagine If 10% of the raw materials exported from Africa were processed in Africa itself, then it would have marvelous results. Then factories would be created. And factories that need skilled workers and skilled technicians. So that immediately need good school and university education. The Africans wouldn't have to go to European or American universities. They could go to their own. And I keep asking myself, well, where is the chance of getting out of this spiral of cruelty? The recipes are clear. First thing, that the IMF would be dissolved. And instead, there need to be neutral methods of financing that tolerate protectionism. In my view, it's only the BRICS countries that would be able to do that today. But we know what's happening in South America, Argentina, when a force that was opposing to the U.S. about that. India is shaky, and whether China and Russia will really collaborate is another question. We need an entirely differently organized successor for the IMF, plus they must be accompanied by a refusal to pay debts, and only then do we have a chance of getting out of this disastrous situation. The hope I have is similar to that of Naomi Klein. Only a catastrophe can help to end capitalism. I say, in future we may have so many refugees that we'd be forced to have an honest discussion about the causes for of these floods of refugees. If someone doesn't want to have so many foreigners come into this country, then has to combat the causes that they flee. And the cause is that people have no opportunities in their home countries and no chance of living a peaceful and satisfied life. People are forced to leave rural areas and migrate to the megalopolises. And then they put all their money together and say, send one of us to go to somewhere where there's a future. Compared to the 19th century Germany, where there crowds of people who were starving marched to the ports to emigrate to the States under police observation. But the right-wingers who react with racist reflexes, if we can explain to them, it's in our interests that Africa and other developing countries should be developed. So that's why I'm hoping for a catastrophe, because I've abandoned my any hopes that rational thinking will achieve anything in this respect.